It happened unexpectedly. What now? My towel slipped off eventually, landing on the floor in a quiet heap. Maria, he whispered, his voice tinged with wonder as his eyes stayed locked on me. His fingers traced along my figure, a touch so careful and deliberate it felt like he was committing every detail to memory. And that's how it all began. Now, before we dive deeper into this story, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Every single click motivates us to bring you more heartfelt stories. If you enjoy what we share, don't hesitate to pass it along to others or leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep building this amazing community together. I genuinely appreciate your support. My name is Maria, and though it might sound like boasting, beauty has been my lifelong companion. Even now at 65, I see heads turn when I pass by. My figure still curvy and graceful, my smooth skin, and my radiant smile seem to captivate people. My thick silver-streaked hair falls in soft waves, and my honey-brown eyes carry a hint of mystery that draws others in. But despite the attention, I've chosen solitude. After my husband passed, I closed the door on romance. Sure, there have been offers, plenty of them. Men of all ages, from silver-haired gentlemen seeking companionship to younger ones whose charm bordered on audacity, have tried their luck. I always turn them down, convincing myself I'm too old for the games of love. Deep down, though, I know the truth. I've locked my heart away, afraid of reopening it and facing loss all over again. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in warm shades of orange and pink, I got a call from my nephew Tom. Tom is Lucy's only child, my older sister's pride and perpetual headache. At 35, he's a whirlwind of energy with a mischievous grin that practically promises trouble. Tall and athletic, with a confidence that borders on cocky, Tom's charm has always been his calling card. Lucy often complains about his endless flirtations. Maria, she'd sigh, this boy is going to drive me to an early grave with his woman-chasing ways. I'd usually laugh it off, brushing it aside as a phase. But deep down, I knew Tom wasn't like most men his age. He had this magnetic quality that made women ignore the obvious red flags and fall for him anyway. Hi, Aunt Maria. His cheerful voice greeted me over the phone. Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Not at all, Tom, I replied. What's up? I was wondering if I could crash at your place this weekend, he asked, his tone carrying an uncharacteristic hesitation. I just need a break. The request caught me off guard. Tom rarely asked for favors, let alone a place to stay. His life seemed full, thriving career, busy social calendar. My home, a quiet, cozy retreat with a garden, wasn't the kind of place he'd typically seek out. But there was something in his voice, a hint of vulnerability that made me pause. Of course, Tom, I said warmly after a brief silence. You're always welcome here. This is your home too. Thanks, Aunt Maria, he replied, his voice a bit lighter. I'll be there Friday evening. As we hung up, curiosity replaced the initial surprise. What was he running from? Trouble with a woman? A fight with his mother? Tom's life had always been a mix of charm and chaos, and this request felt different, like there was more to the story. Friday arrived before I knew it. I'd been busy with chores and suddenly, the sound of a car pulling into my driveway broke the evening's quiet. I stood up, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. When I opened the door, there he was, a familiar yet slightly altered version of the nephew I'd known all these years. Dressed casually in dark jeans and a fitted black t-shirt that hugged his athletic build, Tom looked effortlessly handsome. His bright smile was as disarming as ever, but his eyes gave him away. They carried a flicker of something, restlessness, maybe even pain, that didn't match his usual confident demeanor. Aunt Maria, he exclaimed warmly, pulling me into a tight hug. You look amazing as always. I chuckled at his charm. And you're as smooth as ever, I teased. Come on in, let's get you settled. Tom stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the familiar space. The living room, bathed in the soft glow of warm lighting, welcomed him like an old friend. Yet there was something about his expression, something unreadable, that made me wonder what kind of story he was bringing through my door this time. The comforting aroma of freshly baked bread still hung in the air, giving the room a sense of warmth and calm. My home had always been a haven, a place where the world's noise faded, leaving space for tranquility. But as Tom stood there, glancing around the familiar surroundings, I could tell he was searching for something, perhaps a slice of peace in the middle of his own private storm. What had driven him here? And more importantly, what was he hoping to find during his stay? I had a feeling I'd get my answers soon enough. "Wow," he murmured as he sank into the couch with a sigh, a flicker of relief softening his features. "I've really missed this place." I couldn't help but laugh. "You're acting like it's been decades since you last came by." He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment before replying, "Well, it feels like it. Life's been a lot lately. I haven't had a chance to just breathe." Raising an eyebrow, I stayed silent, hoping he'd elaborate. But he only shook his head, a faint, almost wistful smile playing on his lips. It was clear he wasn't ready to open up just yet. Later that evening, we stepped out into the garden. The gentle breeze danced through the trees, carrying the sweet perfume of blooming flowers, and the atmosphere felt soothing, almost magical. For a while we simply sat there, letting the crickets and rustling leaves fill the silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, but rather a shared moment of quiet reflection. Eventually Tom spoke, his voice softer than usual. "You know, Aunt Maria," he began, his words tinged with an unusual vulnerability. "Sometimes it feels like I'm stuck in a loop. The parties, the women, it's fun at first, sure. But after a while it just drains you." His honesty caught me off guard. This wasn't the confident, easygoing nephew I was used to. The man who always seemed so self-assured now sat before me, stripped of his usual bravado. A pang of worry stirred in me as I realized just how much he'd been carrying. After a moment I responded gently, "Maybe it's time for a change, Tom." He sighed, his gaze drifting toward the garden. "Maybe," he admitted quietly. "But it's not that simple. People expect certain things from me. It feels like if I step off the path they've set, I'll disappoint them." I shifted closer and rested a hand on his, offering a steady look of reassurance. "Tom," I said, my tone firm but kind, "you don't have to live your life for anyone else. You're still so young. You have the time to figure out what you want and live life your way." For a long moment he studied me, his eyes searching mine as though he was looking for answers I might not have. There was something in his gaze, an intensity that made my chest tighten, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The weekend unfolded in a series of quiet but meaningful moments. Tom, who had seemed hesitant and guarded at first, gradually let his walls down. His laughter began to fill the house, and his teasing, playful nature brought a lightness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. It was unexpected but welcome, a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. Still, there were moments, small, fleeting, yet impossible to ignore, when I caught him watching me. It wasn't anything overt, just a lingering glance here and there, or a subtle smile that carried something deeper than simple affection. It stirred something within me, something I didn't dare examine too closely. Tom's presence brought a new energy to my quiet home. The way he moved through the space, effortlessly breathing life into it, was both comforting and unsettling. He made even the simplest activities like preparing dinner feel special. One afternoon, as we stood side by side in the kitchen chopping vegetables, I found myself smiling at his easy charm. His hands worked with a practiced rhythm, but every so often he'd pause, sneak a piece of cucumber, and pop it into his mouth with a grin that made me laugh. "You're spoiling me," I teased, my tone light but touched with sincerity. He shot me a wink, his expression warm and full of affection. "You deserve it, Aunt Maria," he said softly. "You do so much for everyone else. It's about time someone took care of you." His words struck a chord, settling in a part of me I hadn't realized was longing for recognition. I felt a warmth spread through me, an unfamiliar but not unwelcome sensation. The lingering scent of freshly baked bread still hung in the air, adding a comforting warmth to the room. My home had always been a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world seemed to dissolve, leaving only calm and quiet. Tonight, though, as Tom surveyed the familiar space, I sensed a quiet restlessness in him. He looked like a man searching for something, A sense of balance, perhaps, or a moment of stillness in the middle of some unseen turmoil. I couldn't help but wonder what had brought him here, and what answers he might be hoping to find during his stay. "Wow," he said at last, sinking into the couch with a heavy sigh, as though the weight of the world had been lifted, if only for a moment. "I've really missed this place." I chuckled softly, trying to lighten the mood. "You're acting like it's been decades since you last visited," I teased. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a second before answering. "Well, it feels like it has. Life's been non-stop. I haven't had a second to catch my breath." His words piqued my curiosity, but I kept quiet, hoping he'd say more. Instead, he shook his head and offered a faint, almost reluctant smile. It was clear he wasn't ready to delve into whatever was troubling him. Not yet, at least. Later that evening we moved outside to the garden, where the cool breeze carried the sweet fragrance of blooming flowers. The peaceful atmosphere seemed to ease some of the tension in Tom's shoulders. For a while we sat in comfortable silence, the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves creating a soothing backdrop. Eventually Tom spoke, breaking the stillness with a quiet admission. "You know, Aunt Maria," he said, his voice unusually subdued. "Sometimes it feels like I'm trapped in this endless cycle. The parties, the women. Sure, it's fun at first, but after a while it just drains you." His honesty caught me off guard. This wasn't the confident, devil-may-care Tom I'd come to know. Sitting before me now was a young man stripped of his usual bravado, revealing a vulnerability I hadn't expected. A pang of concern stirred within me as I realized just how much he'd been holding inside. I took a moment to think before replying softly. "Maybe it's time for something different, Tom. A change might be exactly what you need." He sighed deeply, his gaze drifting toward the garden as though searching for answers in the shadows. "Maybe," he murmured. "But it's not as easy as it sounds. People expect certain things from me. It's like I have to stay on this path they've laid out, or I'll disappoint everyone." Shifting closer, I placed a hand gently over his and met his eyes with a steady look. "Tom," I said firmly but kindly, "you don't owe it to anyone to live by their expectations. You're young. You've got time to figure out what you want and to live life your way." For a long moment, he studied me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. There was something unspoken in his gaze, a weight to it that I couldn't quite decipher, though it left me feeling oddly unsettled. The weekend seemed to pass in a blur, filled with quiet conversations and moments that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Tom, initially guarded, began to let his walls down as the days went on. I found myself growing more comfortable in his company, his presence a surprising but welcome change. Yet, there were fleeting moments, subtle but undeniable, when I caught him looking at me differently. It wasn't anything blatant, just a lingering glance here, a quiet smile there, as though his thoughts were wandering somewhere they shouldn't. Those moments stirred something deep within me, something I didn't want to examine too closely. Tom's stay turned out to be unexpectedly sweet. He brought a vibrancy to my home that I hadn't felt in years. His laughter echoed through the rooms, and his playful teasing made me feel lighter, as though time itself had momentarily reversed. There was something infectious about his energy, a warmth that breathed life into the quiet spaces of my house. One afternoon, as we stood side by side in the kitchen slicing vegetables for dinner, I couldn't help but smile. He worked with an effortless rhythm, but every so often, he'd pause to pop a piece of cucumber into his mouth, grinning at me like a mischievous child. "You're spoiling me," I said, my tone playful but tinged with sincerity. He shot me a wink, his expression both warm and disarmingly genuine. "You deserve it, Aunt Maria," he replied softly. "You're always doing so much for everyone else. It's about time someone did something for you." His words struck a chord, settling into a part of me I hadn't realized was yearning for acknowledgement. A quiet warmth spread through me, leaving me momentarily speechless. It had been ages since anyone had made me feel truly cared for, and Tom seemed to do it so effortlessly. There was no fanfare in his gestures, just simple, thoughtful acts that spoke louder than words ever could. Whether it was bringing me a perfectly brewed cup of tea each morning or fixing small things around the house that I'd long since stopped noticing, He had a way of making me feel seen, appreciated. For the first time in years I realized how much I'd been missing that kind of attention, and the thought left me with a strange ache I couldn't quite name. But it wasn't just his kindness that lingered with me. It was his playful energy, the way his lightheartedness could sneak past my defenses and catch me completely off guard. Tom had this mischievous streak, a knack for making me laugh in spite of myself. He'd creep up behind me when I least expected it, wrapping me in a sudden hug or pressing a quick, teasing kiss to my cheek or the back of my neck. Every time I'd gasp in surprise, only to hear him laugh softly. "Aunt Maria," he'd say, his voice warm and teasing, "you're way too serious. Loosen up a little, will you?" I'd sweat at him in mock annoyance, laughing despite myself. Yet even after he let go, a warmth would linger, a quiet, unshakable awareness of his touch. It was disarming, the way something so innocent could unsettle me so completely. One evening I was curled up on the couch with a book, enjoying the stillness of the house, when Tom plopped down beside me without warning. With his usual carefree manner, he slung an arm casually over my shoulders and leaned in, peering at the pages I was engrossed in. "Is it a love story?" he asked, his voice low and teasing, but with a note of curiosity that sent a shiver down my spine. "It's none of your business," I retorted, the heat rising to my cheeks as I felt his gaze on me. Tom chuckled, a deep, rich sound that somehow felt too intimate. He shifted closer, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm as he adjusted his position. The contact, though brief, sent a jolt through me, and I stood abruptly, pretending to adjust the curtains to hide my unease. "You're restless," I muttered, hoping to sound irritated, though my racing heart betrayed me. "You love it," he shot back, his voice dripping with mischief. That grin of his, playful, knowing, made my breath hitch and I turned away, unable to meet his eyes. But even as I put space between us, I couldn't shake the way he'd unsettled me, leaving behind a trail of warmth and tension I didn't know how to handle. As the days went on, Tom's presence became impossible to ignore. The way his hands lingered just a second too long on my arm, the way his eyes seemed to search mine during quiet moments, it all stayed with me. His teasing, his casual intimacy, even the sound of his laughter. They all made me feel alive in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I began to anticipate his hugs, his sly remarks, the magnetic pull of his proximity. And with that anticipation came a feeling I wasn't ready to name, a longing I wasn't ready to face. It was late one night, the house wrapped in a stillness that felt almost sacred. The hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional chirp of crickets were the only sounds as I stood alone in the kitchen, putting away the last of the dishes. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Tom entering the room. He was shirtless, his broad chest and toned arms illuminated by the soft, dim light overhead. The sight of him, so confident, so unguarded, made my heart stutter, though I quickly looked away, trying to gather myself. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, as if trying not to disturb the quiet intimacy of the moment. "Not really," I replied, my eyes flickering to his for a brief second before I looked back at the counter, feeling the weight of his attention. He stepped closer, leaning casually against the counter beside me. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were anything but. They held a quiet intensity, searching mine as though trying to draw me out. "You've been quiet today," he said gently, concern lacing his tone. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, though the tightness in my chest told a different story. The air between us seemed charged, thick with something unspoken. The pull between us was almost palpable, and I could feel it wrapping around us, drawing us closer. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching thin but not uncomfortable. His eyes held mine, steady and unwavering, and for the first time, I felt myself faltering, unsure of how to navigate the strange magnetic tension between us. The silence between us hung thick, weighted with things neither of us dared to say. Finally, Tom broke it, his voice low and unsteady, like he was stepping into uncharted territory. "You know, Aunt Maria," he began, his tone almost reverent, "you're the most beautiful woman I've ever known." His words struck me like a thunderclap, sending a jolt of electricity racing through me. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, each beat deafening in the quiet of the kitchen. "Tom," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't say things like that." I averted my gaze, unable to meet the intensity in his eyes, the sincerity that scared me more than I cared to admit. "Why not?" he pressed, his voice steady but edged with vulnerability. "It's the truth." He stepped closer, his movements deliberate but unthreatening, as if giving me every opportunity to stop him. His hand lifted, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair away from my face. The contact was so gentle, yet it ignited a reaction deep within me, a pull I hadn't anticipated and couldn't seem to resist. "Tom, this isn't—" I began, but my voice faltered under the weight of his gaze. "This isn't what?" he murmured, his tone softer now, coaxing. His eyes searched mine, and I could feel the walls I'd so carefully built around myself beginning to crumble. My heart raced wildly as he reached out again, his hand resting lightly on my waist. Even through the fabric of my dress, I could feel the warmth of his touch, the strength in his fingers as they held me steady. The space between us dissolved, and suddenly I was acutely aware of every detail. The heat of his body, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his presence seemed to engulf me entirely. "Tom, we can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. Yet even as the words left my mouth, my body betrayed me. I didn't move away. I stayed rooted in place, drawn to him by an invisible force I couldn't explain. His lips brushed my cheek, a fleeting feather-light touch that made my breath hitch. The warmth of his breath lingered on my skin, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to freeze. Time stretched impossibly thin, the silence between us charged with unspoken emotions and desires that neither of us dared to name. I don't know how long we stood there suspended in that moment, but eventually I broke away, the air between us crackling as I stepped back. My chest heaved with uneven breaths, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Good night, Tom," I said, my voice barely audible. The words felt hollow, insufficient, trembling with everything I couldn't say. He didn't stop me as I turned and walked away, but I could feel his gaze following me, heavy and unrelenting, as if he were silently willing me to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts raced. I replayed the moment in the kitchen over and over, each detail sharper, more vivid than the last. What had I done? What was happening between us? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of confusion that would fade with time. But deep down I knew better. Something had shifted, and there was no pretending otherwise. I hated to admit it, but I craved Tom's attention now in ways I hadn't before. His touch, his gaze, the way he seemed to see me as something more than I saw myself, it was intoxicating. His presence awakened something in me, something I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Tom acted as if nothing had happened. He was carefree, playful, his usual self. But when our eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding between us, a quiet acknowledgement of the line we had crossed. It was subtle, but it was there. A spark just beneath the surface, a tension that neither of us could deny. As the days passed, that tension only grew. His touches became more deliberate, his words more daring, and every glance, every lingering moment, seemed to set my heart racing. It was like a fire slowly building, impossible to extinguish, no matter how much I told myself to step away. I knew I was playing with something dangerous, something I might not be able to control. But even as I told myself to stop, to put an end to whatever this was, there was a part of me, a small, undeniable part, that couldn't help but wonder, what if I didn't? What if I let this unfold? What if I gave in to the pull I felt every time Tom was near? No matter how hard I tried to deny it, Tom's pull on me was undeniable. He awakened desires I'd buried so deeply that I had almost forgotten they existed. Every fleeting touch, every teasing glance, only tightened the web of emotions building between us. I kept telling myself that I could resist, that I had to resist, but deep down I knew the truth. The fire was only growing stronger, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed us both. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, and the air in the house felt heavy and still. Seeking a reprieve, I decided to take a cool shower. My room was bathed in soft light, the golden rays spilling through the curtains and painting the walls with patterns that felt almost otherworldly. The peacefulness of the moment wrapped around me, a rare reprieve from the tension that had been hanging over me like a storm cloud. I slipped out of my clothes, the fabric pooling at my feet, and wrapped myself in a soft white towel. The coolness of the terry cloth against my skin was a relief, soothing and grounding me in the present. My hair was tied back loosely, errant strands framing my face in a way that felt unintentional, almost careless. As I reached for the bathroom door, a thought struck me. My phone was still on the coffee table in the living room. It had been buzzing nonstop earlier, but I hadn't bothered to check it. Whatever it was could wait, I told myself. I had earned this small moment of calm. But then, just as my hand touched the doorknob, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom. The light tread was deliberate, hesitant, and then there was a soft knock. "Aunt Maria?" Tom's voice called through the door, his tone uncharacteristically tentative. Before I could respond, the door creaked open, and there he was standing in the doorway with my phone in hand. His eyes met mine and for a moment he froze. Your phone's been..." His voice trailed off as his gaze swept over me, taking in the sight of me wrapped in nothing but the towel. The steam from my earlier shower still clung to my skin, and I could feel the heat rise to my cheeks as I realized how I must look to him. His wide eyes betrayed his shock, his mouth opening and closing as though trying to find the words to explain himself. My pulse quickened, the rhythm so loud in my ears that it drowned out the world around me. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and the space between us felt charged with something I couldn't define. "Tom," I whispered, my voice trembling as I clutched the towel tighter around me. He didn't reply, but the hesitation on his face melted away in an instant. Before I could process what was happening, he crossed the room in a single stride, standing directly in front of me. His hands reached for my face, cupping it gently, his touch firm yet tender. His thumbs brushed along my jawline, and I shivered under his touch. His eyes locked with mine, searching, pleading, as though seeking permission for what he was about to do. "Aunt Maria," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't hold back anymore." And then he kissed me. The kiss was nothing like I'd expected, if I had expected it at all. It was raw and electric, a collision of emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. His lips were soft yet insistent, moving against mine with a passion that left me breathless. For a moment I was frozen, my mind struggling to catch up with my heart, which was racing out of control. But as his hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, something deep within me stirred. An ache, a longing I hadn't felt in years. "Tom," I whispered, breaking the kiss just enough to speak, but he didn't let me finish. His lips claimed mine again, more urgent this time, silencing any protest I might have made. His hands were steady, grounding me even as my world tilted off its axis. I clutched at the towel, but it slipped slightly under the pressure of the moment. Tom's hands were already there, his touch firm yet reverent as he steadied me. He held me like I was something precious, something he had waited his entire life for. "I've wanted to do this for so long," he confessed, his voice raw with emotion, his words sending a shiver down my spine. I stared at him, wide-eyed and breathless, as his words sank in. He meant them. I could see it in his face, hear it in his voice. I didn't have time to think, to second-guess or overanalyze. My instincts took over, and before I knew it, my arms were around his neck, pulling him closer, bridging the gap between us once and for all. In that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just us, caught in a whirlwind of emotions that we could no longer control. Our bodies moved together with a startling ease, as though we had been meant to find this moment all along. My lips met his with an urgency I hadn't known I possessed, each kiss fanning the flames that had been smoldering between us for weeks. The golden afternoon sunlight, which had once seemed so peaceful, now burned brighter, the heat of it matching the fire coursing through my veins. The world outside blurred and fell away. In this stolen intimacy there was only Tom and me, bound together by something we could no longer resist. At some point my towel loosened and slipped to the floor in a soft, forgotten heap. I gasped, instinctively reaching to cover myself, but Tom was already there. His gaze, heavy and full of awe, held mine. "Maria," he breathed, his voice trembling with reverence, as though speaking my name aloud gave him strength. His fingers, warm and deliberate, traced the curves of my body with a care that made me shiver. It wasn't lustful or rushed. It was as though he were committing every inch of me to memory. Each touch sent shockwaves through me, igniting a longing I hadn't dared to feel in years. I knew logically how wrong this was. A voice somewhere deep inside whispered warnings, pleaded for reason. But reason had no place here. Not in the heat of his embrace. Not when his hands held me with such tenderness. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't a collection of responsibilities, regrets, or self-doubts. I was alive, truly alive, and Tom made me feel that way. His lips brushed against my neck, soft and unhurried, sending ripples of heat and electricity through me. I trembled under his touch, my breath shallow and uneven. "You're so beautiful," he whispered against my ear, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anyone like you." The way he said it, with such quiet intensity, made my heart stutter. My cheeks flushed, and when I met his gaze, the depth of his feelings stunned me. It wasn't just desire I saw there. It was something far deeper. "Tom," I managed, my voice a whisper, almost inaudible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. But before I could say anything more, he silenced me with another kiss. This one was different, deeper, more deliberate, filled with an unspoken promise that he wasn't going anywhere. His hands cradled my face, his thumbs brushing over my skin with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. "I've dreamed of this," he admitted, his voice low and raw, trembling with vulnerability. "Of holding you, of being this close to you. You have no idea what you mean to me." His confession was like a tidal wave, crashing over me and sweeping away the last of my defenses. My chest ached, but it wasn't from pain. It was from the sheer weight of his words, from the realization that someone could see me like this, could want me like this. I reached up, my fingers brushing along his jaw, marveling at how solid and real he felt. "I didn't think I could feel this way again," I admitted, my voice trembling with honesty. Tom's eyes softened and he smiled, a small tender smile that made my heart squeeze. "You deserve this," he said firmly. "You deserve to feel loved, to be cherished, to know what it's like to be wanted. You deserve this, Maria." His words wrapped around me like a warm embrace, and I realized something I hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let go of the doubts and fears that had kept me locked away for so long. The sunlight streaming through the window seemed to bathe us in gold, casting the room in a warm, otherworldly glow. It felt as though the universe had paused, holding its breath for us, allowing this moment to stretch on forever. Tom leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine with a gentleness that made my knees weak. When he pulled back slightly, he looked at me, his eyes searching mine as if trying to read my thoughts. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The tenderness in his question, the genuine concern etched into his face, nearly broke me. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Finally I managed to say, "I don't know." My honesty hung between us, raw and vulnerable. But before I could sink into the weight of it, Tom's hand slid to my waist, steadying me. "It's okay not to know," he said quietly, his voice a balm to my racing thoughts. "Just tell me this. Do you regret it?" I hesitated, searching for the answer within myself. The truth was I didn't. I should have maybe, but I didn't. I met his gaze, my voice barely audible as I whispered, "No, I don't regret it." Relief washed over his face, and he pulled me into a tight embrace, his arms wrapping around me as if he could shield me from every doubt, every fear. In that moment the rest of the world didn't matter. All that mattered was him, was us, was the feeling of being seen and wanted in a way that made me feel whole again. "Not at all." Tom's voice was steady, a quiet reassurance wrapped in simplicity. A warm, genuine smile tugged at his lips as he reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. The gesture felt natural, effortless, as though he'd done it 1,000 times before. His fingers lingered for just a moment, his touch soft yet grounding. Neither do I, he added, his voice carrying an unspoken promise. A vow to hold on to this fragile connection, to explore whatever came next without fear or hesitation. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity, side by side, letting the silence wrap around us like a protective cocoon. The air was thick with things unsaid, but it was a comforting silence, one that didn't demand words. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The weight of the world, the consequences of what we'd done, all seemed distant and unreal. But as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, the serene haze started to lift. Reality crept back in, unraveling the calm that had settled over me. I could feel the threads of doubt and uncertainty weaving their way through my thoughts, tugging at the edges of my contentment. Later, as twilight descended, I found myself alone in the garden. The evening breeze was cool against my skin, carrying with it the sweet fragrance of blooming flowers. The quiet hum of nightfall surrounded me, yet my mind was anything but quiet. I perched on the edge of a stone bench, my thoughts a tangled mess. What did this mean for us? Had we crossed the line we could never retreat from? Could we undo it, go back to the way things were before? Or had we irreparably altered something fundamental between us? The uncertainty was suffocating, each question a weight pressing heavier on my chest. The stillness of the evening only amplified the chaos in my mind. Then I heard footsteps. Tom appeared at the edge of the garden, his steps soft but deliberate. His presence had always been calming, like a steady anchor in a storm. Yet now, it only served to stir the emotions I'd been trying to suppress all evening. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady but gentle. "Aunt Maria," he began, his voice low and even. There was a resolve in his tone that both comforted and unsettled me. "I know this is complicated, but I don't regret a single thing that happened today." He paused, his eyes searching mine. "And more than anything, I don't want it to end here. Not like this." I turned to face him, my heart a storm of emotions, desire, guilt, confusion, and a longing so deep it hurt. His calm, his quiet confidence, only heightened the turmoil inside me. I wanted to speak, to tell him how torn I felt, but the words wouldn't come. Tom must have sensed my hesitation. "I mean it, Maria," he continued, his voice steady but laced with something raw. "I don't care how complicated this is. What we shared today, it matters. I can't just walk away from that." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against me. Finally, I managed to speak, though my voice wavered. "Tom, this isn't just complicated, it's wrong," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The moment they were spoken, I regretted them. But it was too late. They hung in the air between us, heavy and unyielding. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. If anything, his gaze grew more intense, more determined. "Why?" he asked, his voice calm but with a hint of challenge. "Because of what people might say? Because of the age difference?" I shook my head, my throat tightening. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's not that. None of that matters to me." His expression softened, but his eyes never left mine. "Then what is it?" I hesitated, searching for the right words to explain the storm inside me. "It's how I feel about you," I admitted, my voice trembling with the weight of the confession. "That's what makes this so hard. I don't know how to process it, or what it means." For the first time, his confidence wavered just slightly, but his resolve didn't falter. He stepped closer, his presence steadying me even as it unraveled me. "Maria," he said softly, "you don't have to have all the answers right now. But I need you to know one thing." I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "You mean everything to me," he said, his voice low and full of emotion. "And I'm not going to let fear take that away." His words struck something deep within me, a chord that reverberated through my very being. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I could. But in that moment, standing in the garden with the evening breeze wrapping around us, I realized one thing. I didn't want to lose him. There was an honesty in Tom's voice that disarmed me. A rawness so sincere it stirred something deep within me. I wanted to believe him, to follow him wherever this strange and terrifying path might lead. But beneath that longing, darker feelings brewed. Fear of judgment, fear of the unknown, and most of all fear of losing control. Days passed, but the tension between us didn't fade. If anything, it grew thicker, filling the air with an almost unbearable weight. Tom, as patient as he was persistent, gave me the space I seemed to need, yet his presence was always there, a quiet reminder that his feelings hadn't wavered. He didn't push, but he didn't retreat either. Despite my best efforts to create distance, to bury the feelings that churned inside me, I couldn't escape the pull. It was magnetic, impossible to ignore. Every time he was near, it felt like the world tilted slightly on its axis, and I was left trying to find my footing. That moment between us had changed something fundamental, and I wasn't sure if I had the courage to face it, or the strength to resist it. That evening, the air between us felt suffocating, charged with all the things we hadn't said. I sat on the couch pretending to watch television, but my focus was elsewhere. My thoughts circled back to him, to everything we had shared and everything left unresolved. I hadn't heard him enter, but suddenly I felt him. His presence filled the room before his voice did. A subtle yet undeniable shift in the atmosphere. "Aunt Maria," Tom said softly, his voice hesitant at first, then firmer, laced with determination. I looked up, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. His expression was open, vulnerable, yet unyielding in its intensity. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for something. Reassurance, understanding, or perhaps the same answers I couldn't seem to find. Without a word, he moved closer and sat beside me. The careful distance I had maintained between us vanished in an instant. The warmth of his body radiated toward me, and I could feel my resolve slipping. "I don't want to keep pretending," Tom said, his voice low but resolute. "I don't want to act like nothing happened when all I can think about is you." His confession hung in the air, heavy with emotion. He didn't look away, didn't flinch, waiting for me to respond. But the words I wanted to say were trapped in my chest, tangled in the fear I couldn't yet shake. "Tom, this isn't easy for me," I finally admitted, my voice trembling. "I've spent my whole life being careful, staying in control. And now everything feels so different. Overwhelming, even." He listened, his gaze unwavering, his expression softening. "Maybe it's time for something different," he said gently. Before I could respond, his hand found mine. His fingers were warm and steady, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. The simple gesture sent a wave of comfort through me, even as it unraveled the walls I had worked so hard to build. For the first time, I truly looked at him, not as the young man I had known for so long, but as someone who saw me. Saw me. Not just as family, not just as his aunt, but as a woman with desires and feelings I had buried for far too long. His eyes held a depth that made my breath catch, a raw, unfiltered intensity that was both terrifying and exhilarating. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. Like a tide rolling in, it swept away my resistance, leaving behind a quiet certainty I couldn't ignore. Before I realized what I was doing, I leaned toward him. It wasn't a conscious decision, more an instinctual pull, a magnetic force I couldn't fight. The gap between us disappeared, and then my lips met his. The kiss began tentatively, soft and hesitant, but it quickly deepened. It was as if all the emotions we'd been holding back, all the unspoken words, poured into that one act. His hands cupped my face, his thumbs brushing my cheeks in a gesture so tender it sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a kiss. It was a silent promise, a wordless acknowledgement of everything we felt but couldn't say. In that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just us, caught in a current too strong to resist. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed, his gaze held mine. The emotion in his eyes was overwhelming, a depth I couldn't fully comprehend but felt all the same. It made my heart race, as if it were trying to match the electric connection between us. "You mean everything to me," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm of feelings swirling between us. And just like that, the fear that had held me back began to waver. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I felt alive. From that moment on, everything between Tom and me shifted. There was no going back, no pretending we could ever return to the way things had been before. The bond we shared grew stronger, woven together in the quiet moments we stole away from the rest of the world. Whether it was in the kitchen, laughing as we cooked side by side, or strolling through the garden on lazy afternoons, or even just sitting silently on the couch together, the rest of the world faded into insignificance. Each moment felt sacred, timeless, like a treasure only we could understand. Tom had a way of showing me how much I meant to him, both in grand gestures and in the smallest acts of kindness. He'd surprise me with flowers plucked fresh from the garden, their bright, cheerful colors a sharp contrast to the simple rhythm of our days. He left sweet notes in unexpected places, tucked between the pages of a book I was reading or waiting for me on the kitchen counter. Those words, always carefully chosen, never failed to brighten my day. And whenever we were together, his hand would find mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a way that felt so natural, so secure. It was as if he were holding on to something he never wanted to let go of, and neither did I. One evening, beneath a sky scattered with stars, we sat side by side in the cool night air. The world around us was quiet, the kind of stillness that invites reflection. Tom turned to me, his face serious, his expression thoughtful. The warmth of his presence beside me made the coolness of the night irrelevant. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice calm but laced with emotion. Each word carried a weight that settled deeply in my chest. "I'm not going anywhere. No matter what happens, no matter how hard things get, I'm here. I'm with you always." Tears welled up in my eyes, warm and unbidden. His words touched something inside me, a place I had almost forgotten existed. Slowly, I reached for his hand, my fingers trembling as I gripped it tightly. "Tom," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, "you've brought so much light into my life. I can't imagine a world without you in it." He smiled then, a soft, tender smile that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. It was the kind of smile that reached deep into my soul, warming every corner of my being. "You'll never have to," he said simply, his voice steady and certain. He pulled me into his arms, holding me close. I rested my head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was a sound that brought me comfort, grounding me in the knowledge that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. Our love grew quietly but deeply, a bond that was uniquely ours. It wasn't something we flaunted or tried to explain. It was too personal, too sacred for that. Instead, we nurtured it in the quiet spaces we carved out for ourselves, away from the noise and chaos of the outside world. The world might never fully understand what we shared, and that was perfectly fine. What mattered was the peace we found in each other. The way our hearts, once so weighed down by life's disappointments, felt light in each other's presence. Tom, in his quiet and steadfast way, had reignited a part of me I thought was gone forever. He reminded me what it felt like to hope, to dream, to believe in happiness again. His love was tender but fierce, gentle but unyielding. It was a love with its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. A love we held close, protecting it fiercely from anything that might try to take it away. And in that love I found not just him but myself again.